There are rules, of course, in the United States Army. Everybody has rules on the civilian side, the military side. It's no different, right? Rules are there probably for good reasons, most likely, and sometimes not that great of a reason, but nonetheless, the rules that you're supposed to follow, especially in the Army. But not everybody follows every single rule. In fact, there are actually certain ones that I feel like are pretty common that soldiers don't follow. And that's what I'm going to kind of highlight in today's video, because I've got 3 that I can think of that are probably pretty common, maybe some other ones that you can think of, but nonetheless, there's 3 that I can think of that are pretty common that soldiers break. And we're going to talk about that in today's video, and that starts right now. Now, I'm not talking about things where, soldiers do break laws. It's like, drinking and driving, doing drugs or something like that. I'm not saying anybody's perfect and soldiers aren't any different, right? There are some extreme rules that do sometimes get broken even in the Army. I'm more kind of focusing on just some common ones, right? I will say that, yes, it does happen that soldiers do get in trouble for higher crimes, like, maybe drinking and driving or drugs, but it's not probably the most common. It's not the most common rules that soldiers are going to break. So that's why I wanted to kind of express these 3 specific ones that I feel like almost every soldier may possibly break at some point in their Army career. Not every soldier is going to drink and drive. Not every soldier is going to come up hot for drugs, but these 3 are maybe a little bit more of a likelihood that every soldier, or just about every soldier, a higher percentage of soldiers are going to break these. So we'll talk about those 3. Let's get into this first one, though. The first one, though, is related to some restrictions you have while on active duty, right? If you're on active duty, you have your duty assignment, you have a mileage restriction. You have a certain radius that you're not allowed to go outside of just for readiness purposes while on active duty. And if you want to go outside of that restricted area or that mileage radius, basically, then you have to request special permission to do so. But not all soldiers actually go through that process to actually request special permission to leave that area. What is it? I think it's like 250 miles is the most common one, but that's not a guaranteed thing, because if you look up the regulation or whatever like that, there's not like a specific miles that's like in the regulation that soldiers must stay within this specific radius. It basically says that it's, kind of up to the commander's discretion. So the leadership makes that decision as far as what that radius is going to be. I think it's 250-mile radius is the most common one, but there can be some locations that maybe have a smaller radius, a larger radius, especially like, certain locations where you're in more of a confined area where they're like, okay, yeah, you can't go outside of this area. Maybe like Hawaii might have like a tighter restriction. It's going to depend, but 250 miles is usually one of the common ones. So as I'm talking about, not everybody obeys that rule. Not everybody is going to stick to that 250-mile radius, right? If you wanted to go outside of that, you have to usually request a mileage pass to tell your leadership, hey, I want to go to this destination. It's this many miles away. Here's my plan of how I'm going to get there, how I'm going to get back, all that kind of fun stuff. And if, nothing's going on and you can get it approved, cool. Maybe if you're a good, outstanding soldier that's reliable, maybe they'll approve it. But sometimes people just don't want to go through the hassle of going through the process. It's not necessarily a difficult process. Maybe in certain times it can be, or certain scenarios it can be. But for the most part, it really depends on the soldier and what's kind of going on. But nonetheless, I'm always seeing soldiers that are breaking this rule. They're taking off to go back home, to go visit family, to go on some fun little trip with some buddies or whatever, and it's outside that 250-mile radius. And if they get caught, yeah, you can get in trouble. But, they're taking that chance. It's not a common thing where they go like really far outside of that radius. Maybe it's a little bit outside of that radius. It can still happen where they do go pretty far outside of that radius. But the most common times I see people do it is like, let's say an example, they're stationed in Colorado and they got family, let's say over in Utah, right? And then Utah happens to be outside of that 250-mile radius. So they're like, it's only one state over. I can easily get there in a day and get back in the next day or whatever kind of a thing, and not be gone for very long or whatever the case is, and it's not very far, so I can easily drive it. That's usually more common, but I do see soldiers that are all the time even going way outside of that 250-mile radius, but that one's obviously a little bit more riskier, right? You catch a flight and you got to hope that there's no delays, something crazy going on that causes some kind of mishap where you're not able to get back in time. So those ones are a little bit more riskier. So usually I've seen soldiers that usually break this rule are usually going a little bit outside that 250-mile radius, not like anything crazy like 1,000 miles outside of it. If something was to happen, you're outside that 250-mile radius, you got injured, you got in trouble some way, leadership found out about it, sure, you could possibly get in trouble. It may just depend on what the leadership wants to do, how kind of extensive they want to kind of punish you to that, extent type of thing. But Nonetheless, it's up to the leadership, right? There's no guarantee that, oh, if you get busted for this, you're going to get reduced in rank, you're going to get the Article 15. Could just be, a counseling statement. Sometimes it depends on you yourself and your leadership, a combination of things. But yeah, a soldier could get in some trouble, not to the extent of probably getting kicked out of the Army, but possibly reduced in rank or getting kind of fined. Now let's move into number 2 that I got on this list. And this probably happens on the civilian side too, but on the military side, it's no different. Underage drinking. If you are under 21, you're not allowed to drink, even though it's weird that you're able to die for your country, serve in the military, go to combat at the age of 18, but not allowed to have a beer for your country or whatever. So it's kind of weird. And I mean, this still happens on the civilian side too. I know plenty of people that were not in the military that drank underage, because they had some buddies that were over 21 or 21 and able to hook them up with some alcohol or whatever. And they would drink, but it's no different in the military. It's a pretty common one, especially for soldiers like on active duty living in the barracks. The barracks is where you see it the most, right? You're going to have soldiers that are brand new in the Army, 18 years old, 19 years old, whatever the case is. You got other soldiers that are in the barracks and maybe have been around for a while. They're over 21. They might be having parties in the barracks. And it's not like we go and card everybody coming over to our barracks room to hang out and drink. I mean, sure, you probably know the age of people, but for the most part, most people just don't care, right? Right? I mean, you're kind of confined to the barracks. I mean, sure, if your NCOs are coming through and checking on the barracks or doing some stuff and they found that you're drinking and you're underage, they could possibly pursue it and, try to punish you for it. I've seen a lot of NCOs where they're pretty cool about it and they're like, hey, just don't leave the barracks room, all right? Stick to the barracks room. Don't go driving. Don't go do anything stupid. Don't go causing a scene outside or, annoying your neighbors in the barracks. Just keep it cool and maybe everything will be okay. Typically, it's like the soldiers that are not very good drunks and they're, getting wild and crazy and causing problems. And now they have to get higher leadership involved because they did something stupid in the barracks. Then, yeah, maybe then they're probably going to get punished. But you know what? If you can be cool about it, you just stick to the barracks. You're having some drinks with some buddies, playing some video games, watching some movies, watching a football game or something like that. Cool. Just be cool about it probably, but you get out of control and get crazy. That's when usually I see soldiers that get in trouble for that underage drinking. Now, kind of like my example I had earlier, you get caught underage drinking, probably not going to get kicked out of the Army. It's not that serious. We're going to get kicked out, but depending on what kind of happened, when they caused some kind of incident or something like that, it could result in Article 15 because they're like, okay, you were underage drinking, you started a fight with somebody, you did this, you did that, and then yeah, maybe they're going to pursue you and give you an Article 15 about it, but not typically do I see soldiers, that maybe were cool about it. They were just hanging out in the barracks room with some buddies, drinking alcohol, watching a football game, and then your NCOs came by and they start punishing you for that. Maybe, depending on how strict your leadership is, they might have a stern talking to you, right? They may tell you, hey, don't be doing that crap again, right? Maybe get a counseling statement. Maybe if you have some really strict leadership, maybe they will pursue an Article 15. There's no guarantees what they'll do because, again, just like any scenario, it depends on the leadership, depends on what's kind of going on, but it's a pretty common thing that I see soldiers underage drinking, and especially the barracks, like on active duty. Number 3, the last one that I wanted to kind of mention, is fraternization with other soldiers. Now, there's some rules in the Army that means that you're not allowed to fraternize, especially with higher ranking, lower ranking type of thing. And I'm not talking about oh, you're a specialist, you can't be hanging out with an E3 or anything else like that. That's not really what I'm talking about. Is what I'm talking about is there's usually kind of 3 categories they're looking at, right? You have lower enlisted, which are E4 and below. You have your non-commissioned officers, which are E5 and above. And then, of course, you have your officers, the O1, the lieutenants, the captains, and all that kind of stuff. Those are kind of the 3 kind of categories. I mean, they kind of bundle warrant officers in that same kind of category as officers, but nonetheless, those are kind of the 3 categories you're looking at. Or if you're in one of those categories, let's say you're E4 and below, are you hanging out with anybody in those other 2 categories? And if you get caught doing that, yeah, that's frowned upon. That's not really allowed to be done. If you want to have a relationship with someone in that kind of field, that's really not allowed either, unless it was a relationship that kind of existed before one of you, served in the military type of thing. Then sometimes they kind of let it slide. If they're not directly in your chain of command, there's a little bit of gray area sometimes there. I think technically still not allowed, but I do see people find ways to kind of get away with that because they're not in their direct chain of command, because a lot of it especially is really strict on that, right? If you are, let's say, a non-commissioned officer, you're a sergeant, and you decide you want to date someone and they're an E4 and below, then yeah, that's probably going to be extremely frowned upon, right? But if maybe you're a sergeant and that E4 or below is someone that's in a completely different unit, yeah, it's still not allowed, but maybe it might not be quite as strict where people kind of are really getting on you for that. But again, that still depends on the leadership too. Any of these scenarios I've been talking about too. I mean, not even just relationship wise, right? I'm talking about, even like if you just want to be friends with these people, that's still frowned upon, right? Which is kind of like a weird scenario when, especially like you're in E1 through E4, right? You're working your way up through the ranks. You got some other buddies that, are working up the ranks with you. And let's say you make sergeant before they do, right? Well, technically based on Army standards, you can't be friends with those people anymore, which is kind of sucks. And it's kind of weird that now that you're a sergeant and your buddies are still maybe E4, E3, you're not supposed to be hanging out with those individuals. You're not supposed to be going to party with them. You're not supposed to be, going to drinking with them or just going to just hang out, whatever, with them type of thing. You're not supposed to do that. But nonetheless, it still happens. I was guilty of that. I had some friends of mine that we were both E4 together. I got promoted to sergeant and they were still E4 because they hadn't made it E5 yet. We still hung out, right? Now, as long as we're not going off and doing crazy stuff, getting in trouble, then maybe nobody notices, nobody really cares too much. But probably if things were happening where, we were getting in trouble or something like that, then it might start, raising some eyebrows and people might start caring. But it really depends again on the leadership as far as how strict they want to be with some things. I remember a time when I was in Korea, I was an E4 and I was hanging out with an E5, and he'd been to Korea before and he was trying to show me around and stuff like that. And we were at like one of the PXs on one of the other bases in Korea, and some first sergeant noticed, us hanging out. And I don't think we were in uniform. Maybe we were in uniform. I don't remember what it was, but he was like telling, the guy that I was with, hey, sergeant, get rid of that E4. Don't be hanging out with that specialist. You guys better split up, kind of a thing. And I think we split up momentarily and then met back up and stuff like that and said, screw this guy, kind of a thing. But technically that's how the rules work. You're not supposed to be hanging out with people in those kind of different categories. But it still happens. I mean, even above that, I even had a lieutenant that I was friends with, right? We'd go over to his place and party sometimes. And at that party, it'd be me being an NCO, another NCO, maybe an E4, and then that officer and stuff like that. And that's definitely frowned upon. But, we stayed cool about it. But based on Army regulation, that's not allowed. And I feel like that's a pretty common thing that gets broken, especially when you're coming up through the ranks and you have your buddies that are still E4, E3, you get promoted to sergeant. You don't want to just break those ties and be like, sorry, I can't be friends with you anymore. Probably still going to do it, but maybe keep it on the down low type of thing. I don't know. But these were just like the most common rules I feel like that a lot of people break, right? I'm not talking about, like I said, I'm not talking about DUIs, drugs, anything crazy like that. It happens in the Army, but the more common ones are these ones that maybe aren't quite as major as like things like, getting caught doing drugs or drinking and driving or something along those lines. They're the more minor ones that feel like stupid rules. I guess the only one that's kind of not really stupid is technically, the underage drinking. I mean, there's probably a good reason why you need to be over 21 to be drinking alcohol, to be hopefully responsible. But I've even seen people over 21 that are not very responsible. So that one's maybe a little bit of gray area, but some of these other ones, maybe, not that big of a deal. I definitely hate the fraternization one. I feel like, if they're not in your direct chain of command, no big deal, right? But, if they are in your direct chain of command, then yeah, you can possibly be showing favoritism, or they could be showing favoritism towards you because you're friends with them. But if they're not in your direct chain of command, I don't feel like it's that big of a deal. Now, the mileage one, there's good reasons behind that type of thing. Maybe if the process is a little bit easier to get approved for a mileage pass, maybe less soldiers would kind of go out of the way to try to take off outside that 250-mile radius. But nonetheless, these are some of those three most common ones that I feel like are pretty common that people are possibly going to break. And there's potentially other ones. There's possibly other ones that maybe you can think of if you're someone in the Army or maybe a veteran. They can think of, rules that maybe are good, bad, dumb, whatever, that you saw soldiers breaking all the time. And if you can think of one, I would love to hear about it down in the comment section down below. So let me know in the comment section down below what's something you could think of that was a pretty common one. I'm not talking about, like I said, some of the major ones, but ones that are more common to a lot of soldiers. So you see a lot of soldiers, that are not supposed to be doing this, but they do it anyways. I'm sure for some of you that are not yet in the Army, maybe you're interested in the Army, maybe you're curious about some things. Maybe you heard some things. You're like, I heard that you're not allowed to do this. I heard you're not allowed to do that. I'd love to hear about that in the comment section down below. So if you got any of those kinds of questions too, I always love the algorithm, right? You got to love that YouTube algorithm. Make sure to leave a comment, hit that thumbs up, whatever the case is. If you want to support the channel, there's ways to get like t-shirts and cups and all sorts of cool stuff. You can join the Chaos Elite and get, perks like early access to videos. Like some of the members got early access to this video right here. So if you want to join those, you can. If you won't, or maybe, tight on money, you want to keep it cheap, the free thing is making sure you're subscribed, leaving a comment, and hitting that thumbs up, maybe even sharing the video. That's all free, and I greatly appreciate it. But nonetheless, thanks so much for hanging out. Appreciate you watching. I'm Christopher Chaos, and I'll see you next time. See ya.